That's who Jesus is. 1 Peter 2:22 says he committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. John chapter 1, verse 14. So the Word became human and made his home among us. He was full of unfailing love and faithfulness, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the Father's one and only Son. Now, Isaiah 53 tells us that there wasn't anything physically special about him to attract us to him. So we're left with the way that he acted, the things that he said, the way he shined God's light is what drew people to him. And we need to remember that. We need to remember who we're reading about, because these religious leaders bound him, they led him, and they delivered him to Pilate. The best person to ever live, these people bound, led, and delivered him to an enemy. That is injustice. Now, as far as we know, Pilate was the highest official that Jesus ever spoke to, ever had a conversation with. He was a Roman governor watching over Judea from 26 to 36 AD. His position gave him the authority and the power to kind of do as he saw fit for the good of Rome and the glory of Caesar. That was his job. And so as great as he was, he doesn't hold a candle to Jesus. And yet he's here questioning him like a common criminal. Are you king of the Jews? Now Jesus answers him, but he really doesn't answer him. Well, you said so. Because he knows they have different definitions of what a king is. So the chief priests, they start throwing out these accusations. The reason they want to have Jesus killed is because they're envious. Their position, their power, their popularity is in question because of Jesus. So they want to get rid of him. And they found a religious reason to do that deserved death. It was called blasphemy or insulting God. That was false. And since they couldn't carry out a death sentence, they had to go to Pilate to order that. But they knew he wouldn't get involved in a religious matter, and so they had to turn it into a political one. So they start throwing out all these false things. Jesus is leading a rebellion against Caesar, calling himself king. Jesus is keeping people from paying their tribute, their taxes to Rome. All these things are false, and Pilate knows they're false. And he asks Jesus, hey, would you defend yourself? But he doesn't say anything more. Jesus is done with words. No words are going to get rid of the hatred that the chief priests have for Jesus. No words are going to give Pilate the courage he needs to let Jesus go. So Jesus is bound. Jesus is led. Jesus is delivered. Jesus is questioned. Jesus is falsely accused. And Jesus is silent. The greatest injustice ever suffered in the history of the world, and Jesus stays silent. Now, how did he do that? Because he was trusting in his Father's plan. He was trusting in what was written down about him. Isaiah 53:7 says he was oppressed and treated harshly, yet he never said a word. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. And as a sheep is silent before the shearers, he did not open his mouth. Now, as we walk in the way following Christ, we are going to suffer injustices because of that. And in a general sense, already Christians are hated, by our culture. And we are not looked upon, right, in a good light. We are called bigots. We are called racists. We are accused of wanting to hurt people instead of helping people. All of those things are accusations that come at us. And in some cases, those are true. But in most cases, they got us all wrong. All because they have a different definition of love. What love is. Today, it's all about feelings. It's about how you feel. And if you feel good, if you have a loving feeling, then that's a good thing. And if you call it bad, you're bad. You're a bad person. So in the face of these kinds of accusations, it wouldn't be a wrong strategy to follow Jesus and make your words few before your accusers. Now, suffering injustice gets a whole lot harder when it gets personal. You know, when the accusations come flying at us personally, and we know they are false. I mean, when that happens, don't we want to defend ourselves? Don't we want to rise up and say, that's not true? I mean, I know I do. It's one of my greatest faults. I want to be vindicated. I want the charges cleared. I want people to understand it is not me that is in the wrong. But none of that is the Jesus way. He suffered the greatest injustice and didn't try to explain anything. He just trusted the Father's plan, and that's a key to suffering well the injustice. Even though what is happening to you isn't right, even though what they say about you is wrong, even though you could prove that it's wrong, God knows what's right. And his word says in Romans 8:28, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. So there's a time for words, and there's a time to stay silent, trusting God's plan. He is a good, good Father. And he's perfect in all of his ways to us. And his own son suffered injustice. And we will too, following him. So let your words be few, except in prayer. And trust him to bring about good from the suffering. So verses 6 to 15, Jesus suffers rejection. Verses 6 to 15. Now at the feast he used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked. And among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. And he answered them, saying, do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews? For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them, and what shall I do with the man you call the king of the Jews? And they cried out again, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, why? What evil has he done? But they shouted all the more, crucify him. So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas. And having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. So this is one of the most well-known rejections of all time, but also one of the least remembered when we ourselves are being rejected. Mark tells us that there's this tradition that Pilate's been keeping to honor the Passover feast that the Jews were celebrating. He would grant freedom to one prisoner that they asked for. So this crowd, they come and they ask him to keep up his tradition. There was a man named Barabbas. He had committed murder in a rebellion, and that's all we really know about him. We do know that Palestine was kind of plagued with these rebellions, these insurrections, the Jewish citizens rising up, taking matters into their own hands and throwing off their Roman oppressors, or trying to. So it's very likely that Barabbas was part of a gang of violent criminals, and they were in this crowd thinking that they knew a way to get their buddy free. So the problem was they had competition. That Jesus was in custody, and so Pilate, he's thinking this is a way out for him with these religious leaders. He's in a jam. Pilate thinks that the crowd's going to take Jesus, like he's done nothing wrong. So he offers him up to them, and he didn't know that those chief priests had been working the crowd for Barabbas and found it kind of easy to stir up them for him. So he asked, what should I do with your king? And they shout, crucify him. And he's like, why? What wrong has he done? But they shouted all the more. They needed to convince him that they wanted Barabbas instead. And so Pilate, being the good politician that he is, wants to keep them happy. And he has Jesus scourged. And he whipped him. And that was preparation for crucifixion. And they were trying to shorten the time of crucifixion, and that was such a brutal experience, it often killed the one who was sentenced to the cross. That's the treatment that Jesus got. He suffered rejection by his own people. They chose violence over peace. They chose hate instead of love, darkness instead of light, death instead of life. Now, rejection is a very painful experience. And if you've ever been in a relationship and it broke up, you know how painful that is on your heart. And today, rejection can even happen in our digital world, and it's just as painful. It's called ghosting. You ever heard of ghosting? Author and researcher Todd Rose, he wrote this book called Collective Illusions. He says, ghosting's so common it was added to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary in February of 2017, describing this phenomena of leaving a relationship abruptly, ending all contact with the other person, especially electronic contact, text, emails, and chats. He says it's a biological fact that rejection makes us feel like we don't belong and have feelings of low self-worth. He says there's an entire area of our brain that's constantly on the lookout for the smallest hint of negative judgment. So a wounded heart can hurt just as much as a broken leg to your brain. Doesn't take very much for us to experience that social pain. Psychological research suggests even the mildest snub can cause distress. So our internal sensors are so attuned to rejection, we feel pain even when it's remote or clearly artificial. Ghosting produces similar physical and emotional response. Once it's switched on, the ostracism alarm only appears to have one setting, full blast. So rejection makes you feel wrong. It makes you feel less. It makes you feel alone, unwanted, and insecure. Now, it is likely, it is probable that you will suffer rejection for your faith in Christ, for your following him. And to make matters worse, that will come at the hands of people that you call your people. People who love you, people who know you. And it will become all the more painful. See, when our love for him and our faithfulness to him makes our friends and family feel uncomfortable or judged or awkward, they'll distance themselves from us, they'll dismiss us, and they'll ghost us. Breaks your heart. But it makes your brain think you got a broken leg. So is it possible for us to suffer well through rejection? Jesus says in John 15:18, if the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. And these verses in Mark are an example of the world hating him. So if they reject you, it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you. It doesn't mean that you don't belong, that you're not worth anything, that you should just be kicked to the curb. There was nothing wrong with Jesus, and they rejected him. So when we get left out, when we get left behind, when we get treated with hatred, disrespect, when we get ghosted, when it feels like our heart has a broken leg, there's comfort and encouragement in knowing that's how Jesus was treated. And you know, I'd rather be found alone with Jesus than in a crowd calling for his death. The Bible says in Psalm 27, verse 10, even if my father and mother abandon me, the Lord will hold me close. That's how faithful the Lord is. That's how faithful Jesus is. He's going to be more faithful than your family. He's promised to never leave us or forsake us. Proverbs 18, verse 10 says, the name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous run into it and are safe. So even if your friends drop you, even if they abandon you, you have a place that you can run to in the Lord for safety and security. You know, his name is faithful and true. That's Jesus' name. His name is a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. He was despised. He knows, and he sees, and he is with you, even when no one else is. 1 Peter 2, verse 19 says, for God is pleased when, conscious of his will, you patiently endure unjust treatment. So when we suffer injustice or rejection, and we stay on the way, we're conscious of his will, we stay walking in his way, it brings a smile across God's face. And that smile can be encouragement to our hearts, because the joy of the Lord is our strength. When I was 15 years old, I was a freshman at New Palestine High School. They just won state, by the way, in football. My best friend and I were killing time after lunch, just wandering the halls, waiting for our next class. And it was the custom there that the seniors, after lunch, would go into the gym, and they would just kind of sit on the bleachers. And my buddy's brother was a senior. He played on the football team and was basically a god in our school. So for some reason, he wanted to go talk to him. So he and I, we go into the gym where the seniors are, and we get his brother's attention, and he comes down. And for whatever reason, he didn't like freshmen being in senior territory, or he didn't like what his brother had to say to him, or he just didn't like me. He decided to pick me up and dump me head first into a trash can in front of 30 or 40 seniors. That was not a guy that you wanted to fight. So I just kind of slinked off, mad as I've ever been in my life, embarrassed, just kind of wanting to crawl in a hole. I had suffered the worst humiliation of my life, and I wish I had known Jesus then, because he would have helped me suffer well through it. In verses 16 to 20, the soldiers get their hands on him, the Son of the living God, and they make him suffer humiliation. Let's read these verses. And the soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is the governor's headquarters. And they called together the whole battalion. And they clothed him in a purple cloak, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on him. And they began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling down in homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him. So getting the whole battalion together was about 600 soldiers. And that's what they did for Jesus. They gathered all these guys around, and it's really hard to imagine the pain that he was in after the scourging that he had just got. So his bones would have been exposed, possibly his intestines hanging out. He was in bad shape when this was going on. They had wounded his body. Now they were going to try to wound his spirit. So the cloth they put on him was purple, a symbol of royalty. And they twist together this crown of thorns, pushing it down on his head. And then they start saluting him. "Hail, King of the Jews." That's what they would say to Caesar. "Hail, Caesar." They spit on him. They hit him in the head with a reed. They knelt down in front of him, acting out their homage. When they had enough, they took off the purple, put back on his clothes, and sent him to the cross. Jesus suffered humiliation. After being given this conquering king's welcome just a few days before into Jerusalem, now he is as low as a human being has ever gone, getting abused by his enemy, body, mind, and spirit. And he let them. He let them. He let them because he had submitted and surrendered to his Father's will. He let them because he knew it was for us. He let them. Isaiah 50 verses 5 and 7 says, "The sovereign Lord has spoken to me, and I have listened. I have not rebelled or turned away. I have offered my back to those who beat me, and my cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. I did not hide my face from mockery and spitting. Because the sovereign Lord helps me, I will not be disgraced. Therefore, I will set my face like a stone, determined to do his will, and I know that I will not be put to shame." Well, there's help right there. There's help to suffer humiliation well. Now, why? Why would we even want to do that? Suffer humiliation well. Well, Because everything that we want to do isn't in the will of God when we suffer humiliation. You know, we want to fight back. When I was getting out of that trash can, I wanted to fight back. I wanted all those seniors to know I am not someone to be laughed at. I am someone. I wanted them to know. I wanted to retaliate and feel better. But none of that is the Jesus way. We trust our name and our reputation and our spirit into his hands. And